The silence under the bed. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Rebecca Martinez hadn't noticed. She sat at her kitchen table, phone clutched in her trembling hand, staring at the screen that showed no new messages, no missed calls, nothing from David. 14 days. 14 days since she'd last heard her son's voice, since he'd answered one of her increasingly frantic texts with his usual, "I'm fine, Mom, stop worrying." But mothers don't stop worrying. They can't. The morning light filtered through her kitchen window, casting long shadows across the breakfast table, where David used to sit every Sunday, wolfing down her homemade pancakes while complaining about his college professors or his part-time job at the bookstore. Those Sunday mornings felt like a lifetime ago, even though it had only been 6 months since he'd graduated and moved into his own apartment across town. Rebecca's fingers moved automatically to her phone again. Scrolling through their text conversation, her messages formed a desperate timeline. Day 1, "Hope you're having a good week, sweetie." Day 3, "Haven't heard from you. Everything okay?" Day 5, "David, please call me back. I'm starting to worry." Day 8, "This isn't like you. Please respond." Day 11, "I'm calling the police if I don't hear from you by tomorrow." Day 14, "I'm coming over." She'd called the police on day 12, of course. Officer Martinez, no relation despite the shared surname that made her heart skip when he introduced himself, had been kind but firm. 25-year-old adults had the right to go silent, he explained. No signs of foul play, no missing person report could be filed unless there was evidence of danger. David's car was still in his apartment complex parking lot. His rent was current. His employer at the bookstore said he'd called in sick with the flu and would be back when he felt better. "Maybe he just needs space, ma'am," Officer Martinez had suggested gently. Young men his age, sometimes they go through phases. But Rebecca knew her son. David wasn't the type to disappear without explanation. He was responsible, considerate. The kind of young man who called his mother every few days just to check in, who never forgot her birthday or Mother's Day, who still brought his laundry home sometimes just to spend the afternoon with her. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones, in the hollow ache that had taken residence in her chest since day 3 of the silence. The apartment complex where David lived was a modest 2-story building with cream-colored siding and small balconies overlooking a courtyard filled with overgrown shrubs. Rebecca had helped him move in, had painted the living room walls a warm sage green that he'd chosen because it reminded him of her garden. She remembered standing in that empty apartment 6 months ago, proud and heartbroken in equal measure, as she watched him arrange his few possessions in the space that would be his first real home. Now, standing outside apartment 2B, Rebecca felt her stomach clench with anxiety. The morning was crisp, autumn leaves crunching under her feet as she climbed the external stairs to the second floor. David's door was painted the same institutional beige as all the others, but she would have recognized it anywhere. The small dent near the bottom where he'd accidentally kicked it while carrying in his desk. The faded spot where he'd tried to remove a sticker. She knocked first. 3 sharp raps that echoed in the morning stillness. "David? It's Mom. Are you okay?" Silence. She tried again, louder this time. "David, I know you're probably upset with me for worrying, but I need to know you're safe. Just say something, please." Nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, no sound of life from within. Rebecca pressed her ear to the door, holding her breath. The silence was absolute, heavy with wrongness. She tried the handle, more out of desperation than expectation, and nearly stumbled forward when it turned easily in her hand. The door was unlocked. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped inside. The apartment was dark, curtains drawn tight against the afternoon sun. The air felt stale, thick with an undercurrent of something she couldn't identify. Not decay exactly, but the musty scent of a space that had been closed up too long. "David?" Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "David, are you here?" She fumbled for the light switch, and the sudden brightness made her squint. The living room looked normal. That was the first thing that struck her, how devastatingly normal everything appeared. David's laptop sat closed on the coffee table next to a half-empty water glass. His favorite throw blanket was folded neatly over the back of the couch. A book laid open and face down on the side table. The Catcher in the Rye, a worn copy he'd owned since high school. Rebecca moved deeper into the apartment, her footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence. The kitchen was clean, dishes washed and put away. No signs of struggle, no indication that anything was amiss. But the wrongness in the air grew stronger with each step. The bathroom was empty. Towels hung neatly on their hooks. David's toothbrush sat in its holder, dry but not dusty. That left only the bedroom. The door was ajar, revealing a slice of unmade bed and the edge of David's dresser. She pushed it open slowly, her hand trembling on the doorknob. The bedroom was dim, lit only by the faint light filtering through the heavy curtains. She could make out the familiar shape of David's bed, the comforter twisted and pulled aside as if he'd just gotten up. "David?" She called again, though she knew by now that he wouldn't answer. She reached for the light switch, and the room blazed to life under the overhead fixture. The bed was indeed unmade, pillows scattered, sheets wrinkled. David's clothes from several days ago lay on a pile on the floor. Jeans, a gray t-shirt, socks. Normal. Everything looked absolutely normal. Except for the silence. The terrible, pressing silence that seemed to have weight and substance. Rebecca stood in the doorway, paralyzed by indecision. She should call the police again, should tell them about the unlocked door, about the silence, about the way her maternal instincts were screaming that something was catastrophically wrong. But Officer Martinez's words echoed in her mind. No signs of foul play. Young men his age sometimes need space. She took a step into the room, then another. Maybe there was something she was missing, some clue that would explain where David had gone, why he'd left his door unlocked, why he'd vanished from his life without a trace. She was examining the items on his nightstand, a charging cable, a water glass, a small stack of books, when she heard it. A sound. Soft, almost inaudible, but definitely there. Rebecca froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound came again, a faint rustling, like fabric moving against fabric. It was coming from under the bed. Her mind immediately went to the most innocent explanations. A cat that had somehow gotten inside, a mouse, the building settling. But her body knew better. Every instinct screamed danger as she took a step back from the bed, her eyes fixed on the dark space beneath the mattress. The rustling came again, more pronounced this time. "Hello?" she whispered, feeling foolish but unable to stop herself. "Is someone there?" The silence stretched out, oppressive and sick. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, came a sound that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. A whimper. Human. Definitely human. Weak and muffled, but unmistakably the sound of a person in distress. Her knees nearly gave out. Her mind raced through possibilities. David was hurt, trapped somehow, unable to speak or move. She dropped to her hands and knees beside the bed, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. "David? Oh God, David, is that you?" She lifted the edge of the comforter with shaking hands and peered into the darkness beneath the bed. At first, she could see nothing but shadow and dust. Then her eyes adjusted and she saw movement. A shape pressed against the far wall, curled into the smallest possible space. But it wasn't David. It was a girl. A woman, really, though she looked impossibly young and fragile in the dim light. She was conscious, but clearly terrified, her eyes wide and fixed on Rebecca's face. Her mouth was covered with duct tape, her hands bound behind her back. She wore a thin dress that was torn and dirty, and she could see bruises on her arms, dark marks against pale skin. The woman made another muffled sound, trying to speak through the tape, and Rebecca saw tears streaming down her face. For a moment, Rebecca's mind simply refused to process what she was seeing. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening in her son's apartment.
in her son's bedroom. This had to be a mistake, a nightmare, some terrible misunderstanding that would make sense once she had all the facts. But the woman's eyes held hers, desperate and pleading, and Rebecca knew with absolute certainty that this was real, this was happening, and somehow, impossibly, her son was connected to it.
"Oh my God," Rebecca breathed. "Oh my God, oh my God." She scrambled backward from the bed, her mind reeling. She needed to call the police, needed to get help for this woman, needed to understand what was happening. But even as these thoughts raced through her head, other, darker thoughts crowded in behind them. David was gone. The woman was under David's bed. David's door had been unlocked. Where was her son? What had he done? What was he capable of that she had never imagined? Rebecca fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking so badly she could barely hold it. She dialed 911, the numbers swimming in her vision as tears filled her eyes. 911? What's your emergency? There's a woman under a bed. She's tied up. She's hurt. I think she's been kidnapped. The dispatcher's voice became sharp, professional. "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. What's your location?" Rebecca gave David's address, her voice hollow and mechanical. She answered the dispatcher's questions. Yes, she was safe. No, she didn't see the perpetrator. Yes, she would stay on the line until officers arrived. But even as she spoke to the dispatcher, part of her mind was spinning backward through memories, searching for signs she had missed. Had David seemed different the last time she saw him? Had there been something in his voice, his behavior, that should have warned her? The last time she'd seen him had been 3 weeks ago. He'd come for dinner, as he did most Sunday nights. They'd sat at her kitchen table eating pot roast and mashed potatoes while she fussed over whether he was eating enough, whether his apartment was warm enough, whether he needed money. Normal mother-son conversation, comfortable and familiar. But thinking back now, Rebecca realized David had seemed distracted that night. He'd been quieter than usual, responding to her questions with brief answers instead of his usual detailed stories about work or the books he was reading. When she'd asked if everything was okay, he'd smiled and said he was just tired. She'd accepted that explanation because it was easier than probing deeper, because David was an adult and entitled to his private thoughts, because she didn't want to be the kind of mother who pried into every aspect of her grown son's life. Now, that decision felt like the most catastrophic failure of her life. The sirens arrived within minutes, though it felt like hours to Rebecca. She heard car doors slamming, heavy footsteps on the stairs, urgent voices in the hallway. When the police knocked on the door, she was sitting on David's couch, still holding her phone, staring at the bedroom doorway. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Chen. Are you the one who called about a possible kidnapping?" Rebecca nodded mutely. Officer Chen was a compact woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. Behind her stood a younger male officer and what looked like paramedics. "The woman is in the bedroom, under the bed. She's alive, but she's tied up and she looks hurt." Officer Chen nodded and motioned to her partner. "We're going to secure the scene and get medical attention for the victim. I need you to stay out here while we do that, okay?" Rebecca watched as the officers and paramedics filed into David's bedroom. She heard low, urgent voices, the sound of equipment being moved, gentle words being spoken to the woman under the bed. After what felt like an eternity, the paramedics emerged with the woman on a stretcher. She caught only a glimpse of her as they passed. She was young, maybe early 20s, with dark hair and pale skin. She was conscious, but looked fragile and traumatized, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting danger from every corner. The duct tape had been removed from her mouth, and Rebecca could see that her lips were cracked and bleeding. As the paramedics carried the stretcher out of the apartment, the woman's eyes met Rebecca's for just a moment. In that brief contact, Rebecca saw accusation, pain, and something that might have been pity. Officer Chen returned to the living room once the victim had been taken to the hospital. She sat down across from Rebecca, her expression carefully neutral.
Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions about how you came to be in this apartment. Rebecca explained about David's silence, about her growing worry, about finding the door unlocked. She answered every question honestly, even though each word felt like a betrayal of her son. And David, that's your son? He lives here. Yes, this is his apartment. He's lived here for about 6 months. When did you last see or speak to him? 14 days ago. He stopped responding to my calls and texts. That's why I came over. I was worried about him. Officer Chen made notes in her small notebook. Ma'am, I have to ask, did your son ever show any signs of violent or concerning behavior? Any history of mental illness or substance abuse? The questions hit Rebecca like physical blows. No, he's a good boy. He's kind and gentle. He reads poetry, for God's sake. He wouldn't hurt anyone. But even as she said the words, doubt crept in. How well did she really know her adult son? How much of his life did he keep private from her? She thought about all the times he deflected her questions about his social life, his romantic relationships, his feelings about being on his own. We're going to need to search the apartment thoroughly, Officer Chen said gently, and we're going to need to speak with your son as soon as possible. Do you have any idea where he might be?
Rebecca shook her head. I've been trying to reach him for 2 weeks. His employer thinks he has the flu, but... She trailed off, the implications too horrible to voice. We're going to put out a bolo, be on the lookout, for your son and his vehicle. In the meantime, I need you to understand that this is now a crime scene. You won't be able to come back here until we finish processing everything. Rebecca nodded numbly. She wanted to ask about the woman. Was she okay? How long had she been there? What had been done to her? But the words stuck in her throat. Part of her didn't want to know the answers. Officer Chen gave Rebecca her card and explained the next steps. David would be considered a person of interest in the kidnapping. Detectives would want to interview Rebecca more extensively. She should contact them immediately if David tried to reach out. As Rebecca drove home, her mind kept circling back to the same terrible questions. If David had kidnapped that woman, where was he now? Why had he left her there? Was he planning to come back? Had something happened to him too, or had he simply run when he realized he couldn't go through with whatever he had been planning to do? The thought that her son might be capable of kidnapping and imprisoning another human being was so foreign to everything she knew about him that her mind kept rejecting it. But the evidence was undeniable. The woman had been in David's apartment, under David's bed, and David was nowhere to be found. The house felt different when Rebecca got home. Every familiar object, the family photos on the mantle, David's high school graduation picture, the throw pillows she'd made by hand, seemed to mock her. How could she have lived in this house, surrounded by reminders of her son, and never suspected that he was capable of violence? She sat in her living room as the sun set outside, staring at a framed photo of David from his college graduation 6 months ago. In the picture, he was grinning widely, his arm around her shoulders, his eyes bright with excitement about his future. He looked so normal, so happy, so much like the son she thought she knew. Her phone rang, startling her from her dark thoughts. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. Hello? Mrs. Martinez, this is Detective Sarah Walsh with the police department. I understand you're the one who found the victim in your son's apartment today. Yes. Rebecca's voice came out as a whisper. I know this is a difficult time for you, but I need to ask you some more detailed questions. Would it be possible for me to come to your house this evening? Rebecca agreed, and Detective Walsh arrived an hour later. She was a tall woman in her 40s with silver-streaked brown hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. She sat in Rebecca's kitchen, accepting a cup of coffee with thanks, and opened a thick notebook. I want you to know that we've spoken with the victim. She's physically okay, dehydrated and traumatized, but no serious physical injuries. She's given us some information, but I'd like to hear more about your son from you. Rebecca told the detective everything she could think of. David's childhood, his academic success, his job at the bookstore, his few close friends from college. She showed her photo albums, school reports, anything that might help explain who David really was. Did he ever have a girlfriend? Detective Walsh asked. Not that I knew of.
He was always shy around girls, even in high school. I used to worry that he was too focused on his studies, that he wasn't developing normal social relationships. Did he ever express any anger or resentment toward women? Any concerning attitudes about relationships or dating? Rebecca searched her memory. No, never. If anything, he was always respectful, maybe even a little intimidated by women. I thought that was normal for a young man his age. Detective Walsh made more notes. The victim told us she was held in the apartment for approximately 10 days. She says your son brought her food and water, but rarely spoke to her. She doesn't know why she was taken or what he was planning to do with her. 10 days. Rebecca did the math in her head. That would mean David had kidnapped the woman right around the time he stopped responding to her messages. The timing made her stomach lurch. Detective, can you tell me, what is your son going to be charged with when you find him? That depends on several factors, but at minimum, kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment. Those are serious felonies that carry significant prison sentences. Rebecca felt the last of her hope drain away. Even if David had some explanation, even if this was all some terrible misunderstanding, his life was essentially over. The son she had raised, the future she had imagined for him, was all gone. After Detective Walsh left, Rebecca sat alone in her kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of the worst day of her life. Coffee cups, crumpled tissues, the detective's business card with her direct phone number. The house felt hollow, as if the discovery of David's crime had sucked all the warmth and life out of the walls. She thought about calling her sister Maria or her best friend Ruth, but what would she say? How do you tell someone that your son, the child you raised, the young man you were proud of, is a kidnapper? How do you explain that everything you thought you knew about your own child was wrong? Instead, she found herself going through the house, collecting every photo, every memento, every reminder of David's childhood and adolescence. She spread them out on the dining room table like pieces of a puzzle she was trying to solve. Baby pictures, school photos, birthday parties, family vacations, moments from a life that had seemed so normal, so predictable.
In one photo, David was about 8 years old, grinning gap-toothed at the camera while holding a kitten they'd fostered from the animal shelter. In another, he was 16, serious and scholarly in his graduation cap and gown. There he was at 18, loading boxes into her car as they prepared to drive him to college. Rebecca stared at these images until her eyes burned, searching for some sign, some hint of the darkness that must have been growing inside him. But all she saw was her son, the boy who had cried when they had to give the foster kitten back to the shelter, the teenager who had spent his weekends volunteering at the library, the young man who had hugged her goodbye with tears in his eyes when he left for college. When had that boy become someone capable of kidnapping and imprisonment? When had the path of his life diverged so catastrophically from everything she thought she knew about him? Her phone buzzed with a text message. For one wild moment, her heart leapt. Maybe it was David. Maybe he had some explanation. Maybe this nightmare could somehow be undone. But the message was from her sister Maria. Haven't heard from you in a while. Hope you're doing well. Call me soon. Rebecca stared at the message for a long time before deleting it without responding. How could she ever explain to Maria what had happened? How could she tell her sister, who had always been a little jealous of Rebecca's perfect son, that David was a criminal? That Rebecca's pride in her child had been built on a foundation of lies and willful blindness. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, police interviews, and media attention. Someone had leaked the story to the local news, and Rebecca found herself trapped in her own house while reporters camped outside, hoping for a statement from the kidnapper's mother. She stopped answering her phone after the third call from a journalist asking for her reaction to her son's crimes. Detective Walsh called regularly with updates. David's car had been found abandoned at a rest stop about 2 hours north of town. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of what had happened to him after he left the vehicle. His bank accounts hadn't been accessed, his credit cards hadn't been used. It was as if he had simply vanished. The victim, whose name Rebecca learned was Sarah Chen, no relation to the officer, had been released from the hospital and was staying with family in another state.
She had declined to make any public statements, but Detective Walsh told Rebecca that the young woman was cooperating fully with the investigation. "She seems to be holding up remarkably well considering," the detective said during one of their conversations. "She's a strong young woman. But I won't lie to you, this kind of trauma leaves lasting scars." Rebecca wanted to ask if she could somehow reach out to Sarah, if there was a way to express her horror and remorse about what her son had done. But Detective Walsh strongly discouraged any contact. "The best thing you can do for the victim right now is to help us find your son. The not knowing, the fear that he might come back, that's almost as traumatic as what she's already been through." On the 5th day after the discovery, Rebecca finally ventured out of her house. She needed groceries, and more importantly, she needed to escape the suffocating atmosphere of her home, where every corner held memories that now felt contaminated by what she knew about David. The grocery store should have been a simple errand, but Rebecca quickly realized that her anonymity was gone. She caught people staring at her, whispering to each other as she passed. At the checkout, the teenage cashier gave her a look of unmistakable recognition and discomfort. In the parking lot, an older woman approached her, Mrs. Henderson, who lived 3 streets over and whose grandson had gone to high school with David. "Rebecca," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "I heard about your situation. I just want you to know that we're all praying for that poor girl." The words were kind, but the look in Mrs. Henderson's eyes wasn't. She could see the morbid curiosity there, the barely concealed excitement of being close to a local scandal. This was how people would see her now, not as Rebecca Martinez, the woman who had raised her son alone after her husband's death, who had worked 2 jobs to put David through college, who had been proud of her quiet, studious boy. Now she was the kidnapper's mother, the woman who had somehow failed so spectacularly that her son had become a monster. Rebecca drove home in a daze, her groceries forgotten in the back seat. She sat in her driveway for a long time, staring at the house where she had raised David, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. That evening, Detective Walsh called with news. "We found your son." Rebecca's heart stopped. He's alive, but he's in the hospital. He was found by hikers about 50 miles north of where we discovered his car. He was unconscious, severely dehydrated, and hypothermic. It looks like he'd been wandering in the woods for several days. "Is he okay? Can I see him?" "He's stable, but still unconscious. Mrs. Martinez, I need to prepare you. When he wakes up, he's going to be arrested. There will be guards at his hospital room, and his first contact will be with our investigators, not with family." Rebecca closed her eyes, trying to process this new information. David was alive. He was hurt and alone in a hospital room, and she couldn't even be there when he woke up. "Detective, what happens now?"
That depends on your son. If he cooperates with our investigation, if he can help us understand what happened and why, that will factor into his sentencing. But Mrs. Martinez, I want you to be realistic about this. The charges against him are serious, and the evidence is overwhelming. He's looking at significant prison time. After the call ended, Rebecca sat in her kitchen, feeling hollowed out and empty. David was alive, which should have been a relief, but he was also going to prison, probably for a very long time, and the son she thought she knew had never really existed. She thought about the past 2 weeks, about her frantic worry when David stopped answering her calls. She had imagined car accidents, medical emergencies, any number of tragedies that might have befallen her son. But she had never imagined that David himself was the tragedy, that he was the danger she should have been protecting other people from. The next morning, Detective Walsh called again. "Your son is awake. He's asked to see you." Rebecca's hands shook as she got dressed. She had no idea what she was going to say to David, how she was supposed to react to seeing him under these circumstances. Part of her still couldn't believe that her son, her quiet, bookish, gentle son, had done what the police said he had done. The hospital was a 40-minute drive from Rebecca's house, and she spent the entire trip cycling through emotions: anger, grief, confusion, love, disappointment,
fear. By the time she reached the parking garage, she felt wrung out and empty. The hospital room was on the 4th floor, and Rebecca could see the police officer sitting in a chair outside the door before she even reached the nurse's station. Detective Walsh was waiting for her, along with another officer she didn't recognize. "Before you go in," Detective Walsh said, "I need to explain the ground rules. You can speak to your son, but everything you say will be monitored and could potentially be used in court. If he says anything that could be construed as a confession or admission of guilt, we're required to document it." Rebecca nodded, though she wasn't sure she fully understood. She just wanted to see David, to look into his eyes and try to understand what had happened to the boy she had raised. The hospital room was a small and sterile, dominated by the bed and the various machines monitoring David's vital signs. He looked impossibly young lying there, his face pale and gaunt, his hair longer than she'd ever seen it. There were scratches on his arms and face, probably from his time in the woods, and an IV drip attached to his left hand. When Rebecca entered the room, David's eyes opened and fixed on her face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Mom," he said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. Rebecca approached the bed slowly, unsure of what to do with her hands, where to look, how to be a mother to a son who had done something unforgivable. "David," she said, and her voice broke on his name. "David, what happened? What did you do?" He closed his eyes, and Rebecca saw tears leak out from beneath his lids. When he opened them again, there was something in his expression that she had never seen before, a kind of deep, soul-level exhaustion that went far beyond physical tiredness. "I don't know," he said. "I know what I did, but I don't know why I did it. I don't know how I became this. Tell me," Rebecca said, pulling a chair close to his bed. "Help me understand." David was quiet for a long time, staring at the ceiling. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and mechanical. "Her name is Sarah. She works at the coffee shop downtown, the one near the bookstore. I used to see her there when I went in for lunch. She was always nice to me, always smiled when she made my coffee. I started thinking about her a lot, more than I should have." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine, but she forced herself to remain quiet and listen. "I followed her home one day. I told myself I was just curious, that I just wanted to know where she lived. But then I started doing it regularly. I would wait outside her apartment, watch her leave for work, follow her when she went shopping or out with friends." "David," Rebecca whispered, horrified. "I know how it sounds, Mom. I know how sick it is. But at the time, it felt like love. Like I was protecting her, watching over her. I convinced myself that she needed me, that we had some kind of connection." He paused, taking several shaky breaths before continuing. "The night I took her, she was walking home late from work. She had to close the coffee shop by herself, and it was dark. I had been watching from across the street, and when she started walking toward the parking garage, I followed her." Rebecca felt sick. This wasn't the David she knew, the thoughtful young man who had been raised to respect other people's boundaries and autonomy. But it was David speaking, David confessing to these horrible actions. "I didn't plan to hurt her. I just wanted to talk to her, to explain how I felt. But when I approached her, she got scared. She started to scream, and I panicked. I grabbed her, put my hand over her mouth. There was a van parked nearby with the keys in it. I don't even know whose it was. And I put her in the van and drove to my apartment." "You kidnapped her," Rebecca said. The words felt surreal in her mouth. "Yes," David's voice was barely audible. "Yes, I kidnapped her. I tied her up and kept her in my apartment for 10 days. I brought her food and water. I tried to talk to her, but she was terrified of me. She kept crying and begging me to let her go." "So why didn't you?" Rebecca asked. "David, why didn't you just let her go when you realized how frightened she was?"
David looked at her with eyes that seemed decades older than his 25 years, because I knew that as soon as I let her go, my life would be over. She would call the police, I would be arrested, and everything I had ever worked for would be gone. So I kept thinking I could fix it somehow, that I could make her understand that I wasn't a monster, that I really cared about her. But you were holding her prisoner. You were terrorizing an innocent woman. How did you think you could fix that? I don't know. David's voice cracked. I don't know what I was thinking. Every day I told myself I would let her go the next day, but then the next day would come and I still couldn't do it. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move forward with whatever I thought I was doing, but I couldn't go back either. Rebecca stared at her son, trying to reconcile this broken young man with the child she had raised. What happened in the woods, David? Why did you leave her there and disappear? On the last day, she begged me to let her go. She promised she wouldn't call the police, promised she would just disappear and never tell anyone what had happened. And I wanted to believe her, but I knew she was lying. I knew that the moment I untied her, she would run straight to the police. He paused, closing his eyes again. I realized I had to make a choice. I could kill her, or I could run. Those were my only options if I wanted to avoid prison. And Mom, I couldn't kill her. Despite everything I had done, I couldn't cross that line. So I left. I got in my car and drove north, thinking maybe I could disappear, start over somewhere new. But you didn't keep driving, Rebecca observed. You abandoned your car and went into the woods. I couldn't live with it, David said simply. I kept thinking about Sarah, tied up in my apartment, waiting for me to come back. I kept thinking about you, wondering where I was, worried sick. I realized that I had destroyed everything good in my life, hurt innocent people, become someone I didn't recognize. So I left the car and walked into the woods thinking maybe I would just not come back out. Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face. David, were you trying to kill yourself? I don't know. Maybe. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just walked and walked until I couldn't walk anymore, and then I lay down and waited to see what would happen. I thought it might be better for everyone if I just didn't exist anymore. They sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. Rebecca struggled to process everything David had told her. This wasn't the son she knew, but it was still her son, broken, lost, and facing a future that would likely be spent behind bars. David, I need you to know that I'm sorry, not just for what I did to Sarah, but for what I've done to you. You raised me better than this. You taught me to be kind and respectful, and I threw all of that away. I became a monster, and I've destroyed your life along with mine. Rebecca reached out tentatively and took his hand. It felt cold and fragile, like a bird's wing. David, I don't understand how this happened. I keep going back through your childhood, through everything I thought I knew about you, and I can't find any signs that you were capable of this. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe I was too good at hiding who I really was, even from myself. Or maybe I just broke somewhere along the way, and neither of us noticed. Detective Walsh knocked on the doorframe, interrupting their conversation. Mrs. Martinez, I'm sorry, but we need to speak with your son now. You'll have to step outside. Rebecca squeezed David's hand one more time. I love you, she whispered. I don't understand what you did, and I can't forgive it, but you're still my son, and I love you. David's face crumpled. I love you too, Mom. I'm so sorry. Rebecca left the hospital in a daze. The conversation with David had answered some of her questions, but raised many more. How had she failed to see the warning signs? How had her quiet, respectful son developed into someone who could stalk and kidnap a young woman? What did this mean for her own future, her own sense of identity as a mother? Over the next few weeks, as David's case made its way through the legal system, Rebecca found herself living in a kind of limbo. She couldn't return to her normal life. The media attention had made that impossible.
But she also couldn't move forward until she knew what would happen to David. She attended every court hearing, sitting in the back row and watching as her son was formally charged with kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and stalking. Sarah Chen never appeared in court, but her victim impact statement was read by the prosecutor. In it, she described the 10 days of terror she had endured, not knowing if she would live or die, not understanding why she had been taken or what her captor wanted from her. "The defendant stole more than just my freedom," the statement read. "He stole my sense of safety in the world, my ability to trust strangers, my peace of mind. I will never be the same person I was before he decided that his obsession with me was more important than my right to live my life without fear." Rebecca wept as the statement was read, thinking about the bright young woman she had glimpsed for just a moment in David's apartment. Sarah Chen had done nothing wrong, had simply been living her life and working her job, and David had shattered that normalcy forever. David's lawyer, a tired-looking public defender named James Morrison, had advised him to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. The prosecution was willing to recommend 20 years instead of life in prison if David would accept responsibility for his crimes and cooperate with their investigation. On the day David entered his plea, Rebecca sat in the courtroom and watched her son stand before the judge. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and the weight of what he had done. When the judge asked how he pleaded to the charges against him, David's voice was clear and steady. "Guilty, Your Honor." The words seemed to echo in the courtroom, final and irreversible. Rebecca closed her eyes and felt something inside her break. Not the love for David, but the image of who he was, who she had thought she had raised him to be. After the hearing, she was approached by a woman she didn't recognize, a social worker who specialized in families of perpetrators of violent crimes.
Mrs. Martinez, I'm Linda Torres. I work with families who are dealing with situations like yours. I know this is an incredibly difficult time, and I want you to know that there are resources available to help you process what's happened. Rebecca looked at Linda Torres with exhaustion. I don't even know what I'm supposed to feel. Am I supposed to hate my son for what he did? Am I supposed to forgive him? Am I supposed to feel guilty that I somehow failed as a mother? You're supposed to feel whatever you feel, Linda said gently. There's no right or wrong way to react when someone you love commits a serious crime. But I can tell you that isolation and shame don't help anyone. You might benefit from speaking with other parents who have been through similar experiences. Rebecca wasn't sure she wanted to meet other parents whose children had done terrible things. She wasn't sure she wanted to be part of that particular club. But as the weeks passed and her isolation deepened, she began to consider Linda's suggestion. The support group met in the basement of a community center across town. When Rebecca arrived for her first meeting, she found 8 other people sitting in folding chairs arranged in a circle. They were mostly women, mostly middle-aged, and they all had the same haunted look that Rebecca had seen in her own mirror lately. Linda Torres facilitated the group, and she began each session the same way. This is a safe space for people whose loved ones have committed serious crimes. We don't judge here, and we don't minimize what our family members have done. We're here to support each other through the aftermath. Rebecca listened as the other group members shared their stories. There was Margaret, whose son had been convicted of armed robbery. There was Robert, whose daughter had killed someone while driving drunk. There was Patricia, whose husband had been arrested for child pornography. Each story was different, but the aftermath was remarkably similar. The shock, the media attention, the loss of friends and community support, the struggle to reconcile love for their family member with horror at what that person had done. I keep thinking I should have seen it coming. I keep going back through our marriage looking for signs that my husband was what he was, but I can't find them. Either he was incredibly good at hiding it, or I was incredibly blind. Maybe both, said Margaret. Maybe we see what we want to see in the people we love. Rebecca found herself nodding.
She thought about all the times David had deflected her questions about his social life, all the times she had accepted his explanations without digging deeper. She had wanted to believe that her son was exactly who he appeared to be: quiet, studious, respectful, because that made her life easier and her role as his mother more successful.
But what if she had asked more questions? What if she had been more involved in his adult life, more aware of his struggles with loneliness and social isolation? Would that have made a difference? Or would David have found a way to hide his growing obsession regardless? The hardest part, Robert said during one meeting, is that I still love my daughter. I know what she did was wrong. I know someone died because of her choices, but she's still my child. I still want to protect her, even though she doesn't deserve protection. Rebecca understood that feeling completely. Even knowing what David had done to Sarah Chen, even understanding the trauma he had caused, she still felt a maternal urge to defend him, to explain his actions, to find some way to minimize his responsibility. It was a shameful feeling, but it was real. As the months passed, Rebecca began to build a new kind of life. She moved to a different town where the media attention had died down and people didn't immediately recognize her as the kidnapper's mother. She found a job at a library, working quietly among books and helping patrons with their research requests. It was peaceful work that didn't require her to explain herself or her past. She visited David in prison once a month. The conversations were stilted and painful, both of them struggling to find a way to relate to each other in this new reality. David was participating in therapy and educational programs, trying to understand how he had become capable of such violence. He sent Rebecca letters between visits, filled with apologies and attempts at self-analysis that broke her heart. "I think I was angry," he wrote in one letter, "not at Sarah specifically, but at the world, at my loneliness, at the fact that I couldn't seem to connect with people the way other people did. I convinced myself that she was the answer to all my problems, that if I could just make her understand how much I cared about her, everything would be perfect. I see now how delusional that was, but at the time it felt completely rational." Rebecca kept all of David's letters in a shoebox in her closet, though she wasn't sure why. They were painful reminders of everything that had gone wrong, but they were also the only way she had to track her son's progress toward understanding and redemption. 2 years after David's arrest, Rebecca received an unexpected phone call. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, she heard a young woman's voice. "Mrs. Martinez? This is Sarah Chen." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. She had thought about Sarah constantly over the past 2 years, had wondered how she was healing from her trauma, had wanted desperately to reach out, but had been advised against it by everyone from Detective Walsh to Linda Torres. "Sarah," Rebecca said, unsure of what else to say. How are you?" "I'm okay," Sarah said, though her voice carried a weight that suggested the answer was more complicated than that. "I'm calling because I wanted to talk to you. I know this might seem strange, but I've been working with a therapist on my recovery, and she suggested that it might help me to speak with you." "Of course," Rebecca said immediately. "Whatever you need. I can't begin to tell you how sorry I am for what my son did to you." "That's actually what I wanted to talk about. Mrs. Martinez, I need you to know that what David did to me wasn't your fault. I've read some of the media coverage, and I know that people have blamed you, have suggested that you should have seen the signs or done something to prevent it. But I want you to know that I don't blame you." Rebecca felt tears spring into her eyes. "Sarah, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," Sarah interrupted gently. "Because carrying around anger and blame has been poisoning me for 2 years. I'm not ready to forgive your son. I may never be ready for that, but I can forgive you, because you didn't do anything wrong. You loved your child and tried to raise him well. You couldn't have known what he was capable of." They talked for an hour, and by the end of the conversation, Rebecca felt something shift inside her chest,
a loosening of the guilt and shame that had been crushing her for 2 years. Sarah's forgiveness didn't erase what had happened, didn't make David's actions any less terrible, but it gave Rebecca permission to stop blaming herself for failing to prevent the unpreventable. I want you to know that I'm doing well. I finished my degree, I'm working at a nonprofit that helps other crime victims, and I'm in a relationship with someone who makes me feel safe and loved. Your son took 10 days of my life, but he didn't take my future. I wanted you to know that. After the call ended, Rebecca sat in her small apartment, feeling something she hadn't experienced in 2 years, a sense of peace. Not happiness, exactly, and certainly not forgiveness for what David had done, but a kind of acceptance that allowed her to breathe freely for the first time since that terrible day when she had found Sarah under David's bed. She thought about the support group, about the other parents who were struggling to rebuild their lives after their children's crimes. She thought about David in his prison cell, working to understand and atone for what he had done. She thought about Sarah, building a new life from the pieces that David had shattered. None of them would ever be the same people they had been before that dark chapter began. David would spend the next 18 years in prison paying for his crimes. Sarah would carry the trauma of those 10 days for the rest of her life. And Rebecca would always be the mother of a man who had done something unforgivable. But they were all still alive. They were all still trying to find meaning and purpose in the aftermath of tragedy. And perhaps that was enough. Not redemption, exactly, but the possibility of moving forward, of building something new from the ruins of what had been lost. Rebecca looked at the framed photo on her mantle, not the graduation picture she had once displayed, but a newer photo of herself with her support group friends. They were an unlikely family, bound together not by blood, but by shared trauma and the determination to survive it. In the photo, they were smiling, not the bright, uncomplicated smiles of people who had never known real pain, but the quieter, deeper smiles of people who had found each other in the darkness and chosen to keep walking toward whatever light they could find. It wasn't the life Rebecca had imagined for herself. It wasn't the future she had planned when she had held baby David in her arms 25 years ago, full of hope and dreams for who he might become. But it was her life now, and she was learning to live it with something approaching grace. The silence under the bed had changed everything. It had revealed truths that couldn't be unknown, had shattered illusions that couldn't be rebuilt. But it had also led to unexpected connections, hard-won wisdom, and the kind of strength that only comes from surviving the unthinkable. Rebecca Martinez was no longer just a mother. She was a survivor, a member of a community of people who understood loss in its deepest form, and a woman who had learned that love and horror could coexist in the same heart without destroying it. As she prepared for her monthly visit to see David, Rebecca felt the familiar weight of grief and disappointment settle on her shoulders. But alongside it was something new, the knowledge that she would survive this visit as she had survived all the others, and that tomorrow she would wake up and continue the difficult work of building a meaningful life from the pieces that remained. The story would never have a happy ending, but it would have an ending she could live with, and in the aftermath of such devastation, that was more than she had ever dared to hope for.